Hi, Chris Murray here. We're going to be taking a look at a quick and easy way to bring life to your architectural visualization scenes or your environments by adding some billowing curtains. I'm going to show you how to create the curtains, how to attach them to the curtain rods, how to use MassFX cloth to create the curtain fabric, and the wind force to actually billow the curtains. We'll then use the point cache modifier to copy the animation and offset it so that you don't always have to calculate the simulation whenever you want to use the curtain. Okay, so let's take a look at our scene setup before we actually start making the billowing curtains. I have a real simple room here, not even a complete room, just part of a room. We can fill that all out later if we need to. I also have windows here, and I have curtain rods. Now, these are just straight up cylinders, and then I have curtain rings. All of these rings are just toruses that have been attached to one another. So each one of these rings is all part of one object. So I have them all duplicated here just in anticipation of bringing these up. And obviously, with the curtain rods, maybe I would have some attachments there to the wall, but I don't need it for this example, so I didn't even bother to create it. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my view to the back view so that I can create my curtains. Let's go ahead and create that geometry now. I'm just going to create a very simple plane object. I have auto grid on so that I can just create it right against the wall there. I want to take it all the way down just to about the floor, above the floor actually, because when we turn this into cloth, it's going to stretch, and I'm just going to move it out in front of the window a little bit. All right, so that's the basics of the curtain there. Let's go ahead and make sure that we have our object name properly, curtain 01, because we're going to duplicate this. Okay, now how about subdividing it? Well, I have lengths and width segments. How do we determine what we want to use? I'm going to set my width segments first. I'm going to set those to 10. I have 11 rings here, and what I want to do is I want to roughly match up the vertical segments with each one of these rings. You can see that it basically does that. It's not quite exact, but that's okay. That's because my plane is a little bit wider than the amount of rings. But I'm doing this in case I want to go back in later and get really specific and maybe have each one of these vertices assigned specifically to one of those rings. Just looking ahead, I don't know if I'm going to use it or not. The length segments, I want to make sure that I have enough segmentation in there so that it divides evenly, and when we do the cloth simulation, it gives me a nice flowing cloth effect. I don't necessarily want to have too many segments in there, otherwise it'll just take forever to solve, and it's just not necessary. So I have length segments of 45 and width segments of 10. Now, before we start doing the cloth simulation, I have one more thing I want to do. I want to convert that to an editable poly, and I want each one of these curtains to have basically two panels. Remember, I said sets of curtains, so each one of these is a set. So what I want to do is I'm going to select half of the polygons on one side of the curtain, and I'm going to detach them. When I detach them, I'm going to say detach to element right here. I'm going to make sure that's checked. And what this does is this basically divides the geometry into two distinct sub-objects. So I have two different tabs. Could I have just made one half of it and then copied it and attached it? Sure, I could have done that. This is just an easier way to do it in this specific instance. So 6 to 1, half dozen to the other, whichever way you want to do it is fine with me. So we'll go ahead and just position this up a little bit, get it a little bit closer, and now we're ready to add MassFX cloth. So I have the MassFX toolbar here, and if you don't see it on your interface, just on the button bar anywhere, I usually do it right below the selection set box, just right click, and you'll see MassFX toolbar. It's right there. So you can just bring it back up, and I'm just going to dock it there. And we have a bunch of settings. We're ready to go and try to start to assign them. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on mCloth. I just clicked mCloth, and it automatically assigned it to this. And if I back out a little bit and I just play the simulation, it should begin acting like cloth. And we can see it does. It's a little rough, a little stiff. That's okay. Let's go ahead and load one of the presets here to make it a little bit better. We'll say cotton, load, and now it will play back a little bit more like cotton. Probably still not perfect. We can adjust any one of these density scales here to get better results, but for right now, it'll work. The next thing we need to do is actually constrain the curtain to the curtain rod. So in order to do that, I'm going to back out a little bit, go into vertex mode, and I'm going to select all of the vertices across the top of the curtain. This is why I want them to be one object and comprised of two sub-objects, so that I can get all of these vertices without having to go touch two different objects. So I'm going to make a group out of those objects, and we'll call this curtain top. Okay, and it says these are currently unassigned. So we want to assign them to be constrained to a specific object. So in this case, it's going to be the rings at the top. So we're going to use node setting and just attach it right there. And now what happens is when the simulation begins, these vertices will stay attached to this node. So let's go ahead and back out a little bit, go back up to the top of the stack, and do the simulation. And it actually did it. I don't know if you noticed that, but it is happening. If you look at the bottom of the screen here, we can see that our cloth is actually simulating. If I go into live drag mode, let's go back here. See, I can drag and pull the cloth. All right. So you can see that it actually is simulating properly. I'll turn off live drag, go back to here. Now, let's get it billowing in the wind a little bit. So in order to do that, I'm going to add a space warp called wind. And again, I'm using auto grid, and I'm just going to create the wind right on the wall. It's important to understand that unless you're doing using the decay feature or maybe some range indicators or something like that, you don't actually have to have the wind space warp in front of the windows. It only needs to be in the scene, and you'll notice that it has a directional arrow, and that's going to tell you which way the wind is blowing. So I used auto grid just to keep it simple. So I'll go to my modify command panel. I can see that my strength is 1. These are just the default settings. So we're ready to add it to this scene here. So we're ready to add it to the mCloth simulation. So I just go back to mCloth. I'm going to say add, and I'll just click on the wind, which is right there. And I'll go ahead and press play. And you can see right away that it's blowing in the wind a little bit. Okay, that's great. It's just kind of flopping there. It'd be nice if it were a little more realistic. What can we do to make that a little bit more realistic? Well, there are a couple of things that we can do. One involves the wind object, and the second option involves the cloth itself. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the wind object, and I'm going to increase the strength a little bit, and I'm also going to add turbulence to it. And these are fluctuations in the wind velocity. So I'm just going to add an amount of turbulence that's 25. You might want to play around with this a little bit. The nice thing about this is while this is simulating, you can actually see the changes. So for example, if I set the wind up to 5, you can see it blows a lot harder. And if I set it down to 0, you can see the wind stops. Now, before I go any further, I do want to mention one other thing, and that is on the wall object, I have added the MassFX rigid body modifier, which is this one right here. I have added it to the scene. If I didn't do that, the curtains would go through the wall whenever they came in contact to it. So that's one little tip that you may want to consider when you do this. So we have our curtains going. We have the wind blowing at a specific rate. We could also maybe adjust the frequency a little bit to give it a little bit more fluctuation. The next thing I want to do, though, is I really kind of want to adjust some of the settings on the cloth so that it gives us a more natural feel. We've already loaded the cotton preset, but that's still not really give us the billowing that we want. What I want to do is I want to adjust the compression and the dampening a little bit here. I'm going to set the dampening down to 0. And you can see that just by doing that, we get a nice billow effect that's going to look, fairly realistic. I can adjust the friction as well. I can set that down to 0 and really make it like loose and lacy. Once I see that, I can come up here and maybe adjust the strength a little bit. We'll bring this, 0.75, slow it down a little bit. Okay, that's not bad. The turbulence may be a little much, so let's bring the turbulence down to 10. All right, now we have something that looks pretty good, okay? Now that we have the curtains billowing in the wind, let's go ahead and duplicate them and offset their animation. Be sure to check out part 2 of this tutorial where we bake the animation, set up the point cache files, and offset the animation for a good-looking billowing curtain.